The whip came down 50 times on Joshua's back, each strike designed to break his body and his spirit. But when the overseer finally stopped, exhausted from his own cruelty, Joshua lifted his head and looked him straight in the eye without a single tear, without a single plea for mercy. And in that moment, everyone watching understood that there are some souls that cannot be broken, no matter how much violence is inflicted upon them. This is the story of how one man's refusal to surrender his dignity became a legend whispered in slave quarters across 3 states, and how his unbreakable spirit inspired an entire generation to understand that physical chains cannot imprison what lives in the heart and mind. If you want to follow more stories of extraordinary resilience, spiritual strength, and the triumph of the human spirit over systems designed to destroy it, make sure to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss another story like this one. Now let me take you back to 1842, to a cotton plantation in northern Mississippi, where a man named Joshua was about to face a test that would define not just his life, but the lives of everyone who heard his story. Joshua was born in 1810 in South Carolina, though he had no memory of his mother because she died when he was 3 years old, worked to death in the rice fields that made wealthy men wealthier. He was raised by his grandmother, a woman named Esther, who was nearly 70 years old and who had been enslaved since she was a child, brought from West Africa on a slave ship in 1765. Esther was a repository of knowledge, stories, songs, and most importantly, a philosophy of survival that she passed down to her grandson with the intensity of someone who knew her time was limited. Joshua, she would tell him when they were alone in their cabin at night, they can own your body, they can make you work, they can beat you, they can sell you, but they cannot own what is inside you unless you let them. Your mind, your spirit, your sense of who you are that belongs to you. Never give it away. Never let them make you believe you are less than human. You are whole, you are complete, you are worthy, no matter what they say or do. Those words became the foundation of Joshua's identity, the core belief that would sustain him through everything that followed. When he was 12 years old, he was sold away from his grandmother, torn from the only family he had ever known, and taken to a plantation in Georgia. He never saw Esther again, but he carried her words with him like a sacred text, repeating them to himself in the fields, in the cabin at night, in every moment when the cruelty of his circumstances threatened to overwhelm him. I am whole, I am complete, I am worthy, they do not define me. This internal mantra became his shield, his source of strength, the thing that allowed him to maintain his sense of self even when everything external tried to strip it away. Joshua grew into a strong, intelligent man, someone who learned quickly and worked efficiently, not because he accepted his enslavement, but because he understood that competence gave him a certain amount of autonomy and reduced the amount of direct supervision and violence he faced. He became skilled at reading people, understanding what the overseers wanted before they asked for it, anticipating problems before they occurred, making himself valuable enough that he was treated slightly better than others, though better is a relative term in the context of slavery. By the time he was 25, he had been sold twice more and had ended up on the Jameson plantation in northern Mississippi, a large cotton operation with over 150 enslaved people, run by a man named Robert Jameson, who prided himself on being a modern and efficient plantation owner. Jameson believed in what he called systematic management, which meant detailed record-keeping, strict schedules, measured rations, and punishment that was consistent and public so as to serve as deterrence. He saw enslaved people as economic assets to be maximized, not as human beings. And he ran his plantation like a factory, measuring productivity and adjusting inputs to optimize outputs. And it was a cold, calculated cruelty that in some ways was worse than the explosive violence of overseers who acted out of rage, because it was methodical, rational, and utterly devoid of any recognition of humanity. Joshua understood this immediately when he arrived at the Jameson plantation in 1835. He understood that he was dealing with a man who saw him as a machine, not as a person, and that survival would require playing that role while protecting his inner self from the dehumanization. For 7 years, Joshua navigated this environment successfully. He worked hard, followed rules, avoided attention, and built relationships with other enslaved people on the plantation, creating a network of mutual support and shared resistance that took forms small and large, sharing food, caring for each other's children, teaching each other skills, slowing work when overseers were not watching, sabotaging equipment in subtle ways, protecting each other from the worst of the overseer's violence when possible. Joshua became someone the community relied on, someone who was steady and strong, someone who embodied that philosophy his grandmother had taught him. They do not define me, I define myself. But in 1842, everything changed because of a woman named Naomi. She was 24 years old, had been on the Jameson plantation her entire life, and was one of the most respected people in the enslaved community because of her intelligence, her kindness, and her fierce spirit. Joshua had loved her from a distance for 2 years, too afraid to approach her because forming attachments in slavery was dangerous. People you loved could be sold away at any moment, used as leverage against you, turned into sources of pain. But Naomi approached him one evening after work, looked him in the eye, and said, "I know you care about me. I care about you too. And I know loving someone in this place is dangerous. But refusing to love, refusing to connect, refusing to be fully human because we are afraid of pain, that is another way they win. I would rather risk the pain and be fully alive than protect myself and be half dead. What about you?" Joshua understood in that moment that Naomi was offering him not just romantic love, but a philosophical challenge. Would he live fully despite the circumstances, or would he allow slavery to take not just his freedom, but also his capacity for connection and joy? He chose to live fully. He and Naomi began a relationship that was recognized within the enslaved community, though not formally because enslaved people were not allowed legal marriage. They made promises to each other, shared a cabin when possible, dreamed of a future that seemed impossible, but that they refused to stop imagining. For 6 months, Joshua experienced a happiness he had not known since childhood, a sense of wholeness that came from being loved and loving in return, from having someone who saw him not as a slave, but as a complete human being. But that happiness made him visible in a way that was dangerous. One of the overseers, a man named Cyrus Boone, who was known for his cruelty and his particular hatred for enslaved people who showed any sign of dignity or spirit, noticed the relationship between Joshua and Naomi. Boone was the kind of man who needed to dominate others, to feel powerful, who resented any expression of humanity in enslaved people because it contradicted his need to see them as less than human. He began to target both Joshua and Naomi, finding excuses to punish them, assigning them the hardest and most degrading tasks, looking for any opportunity to break them. The breaking point came on a hot day in August 1842. Naomi was working in the field, moving slower than usual because she was sick, running a fever that she had hidden from the overseers, because showing weakness could result in being denied rations or subjected to medical treatments that were often worse than the illness. Boone saw her pause to catch her breath and marched over, screaming at her to move faster. When she tried to explain that she was ill, he raised his hand to strike her. Joshua, working 20 feet away, saw what was about to happen and reacted on instinct. He ran between Boone and Naomi, blocking the blow. "She is sick," Joshua said, his voice calm but firm. "She needs rest, not punishment." The field went silent. Everyone stopped working, frozen by what they had just witnessed. An enslaved man had directly challenged an overseer, had physically intervened to protect someone, had spoken as if he had the right to an opinion about how another enslaved person should be treated. It was an unforgivable transgression in the logic of slavery, a direct challenge to the hierarchy that kept the entire system functioning. Boone's face turned red with rage. You dare to tell me what to do? You dare to put your hands on me? Joshua had not actually touched Boone, but facts did not matter. What mattered was that power had been challenged, and power had to reassert itself brutally, or risk losing its grip. Boone called for the other overseers, and within minutes, Joshua was surrounded, grabbed by multiple men, and dragged toward the whipping post that stood in the center of the plantation, visible from everywhere, a constant reminder of what happened to those who stepped out of line. Naomi screamed, trying to run after them, but was held back by other enslaved women who knew that her interference would only result in her being punished as well. Joshua did not resist as they tied his wrists to the post, did not struggle or plead. He knew what was coming, and he knew that how he faced it would matter, not just for him, but for everyone watching. This was not just about physical survival, it was about spiritual survival, about maintaining his sense of self, even as they tried to destroy it. Robert Jameson was summoned from the main house to witness the punishment, as was his custom for serious infractions. He listened to Boone's report of what had happened, nodded, and pronounced judgment. 50 lashes. He interfered with an overseer performing his duties, challenged authority, and demonstrated a dangerous level of defiance. This cannot be tolerated. The punishment will be carried out immediately and publicly so that everyone understands the consequences of such behavior. 50 lashes was a number chosen to be just below the threshold that would likely kill a person, though death from such a beating was still possible, especially if infection set in afterward. It was meant to destroy not just the body but the will, to break the person so completely that they would never again dare to assert themselves. Boone was given the whip, a thick leather instrument designed specifically for this purpose, and he prepared to carry out the punishment with visible enthusiasm. The entire enslaved population of the plantation was forced to watch, over 150 people made to stand in the heat and witness what happened to one of their own, made to internalize the message. This is what happens when you forget your place, when you act as if you are human, when you dare to protect someone you love. Joshua, tied to the post, his back bare, took a deep breath and closed his eyes. He thought of his grandmother Esther, heard her voice in his mind. They can beat your body, but they cannot touch your spirit unless you let them. You are whole. You are complete. You are worthy. The first lash fell, and pain exploded across Joshua's back like fire. The second lash crossed the first, creating a pattern of agony. The third, fourth, fifth, each one building on the last until pain was the only reality, the only thing that existed in the world. But even as his body screamed, even as blood began to run down his back, even as his consciousness started to fragment from the intensity of the suffering, Joshua held on to one thing: his grandmother's words, his sense of self, his refusal to give them what they wanted, which was to see him beg, to see him break, to see him reduced to nothing but pain and submission. By the 20th lash, people in the watching crowd were crying, unable to bear witness to this brutality inflicted on someone they knew, someone they loved. By the 30th lash, Boone was sweating from the effort, the physical exertion of beating another human being taking its toll, even on the perpetrator. By the 40th lash, Naomi had collapsed, held up by the women around her, her voice hoarse from screaming Joshua's name. By the 50th lash, Joshua's back was a mass of torn flesh, blood soaking into the ground beneath him, his body barely conscious, held up only by the ropes that bound his wrists to the post. But he had not cried out. He had not begged for mercy. He had not given them the satisfaction of his submission. When Boone finally stopped, exhausted and perhaps disturbed by his own capacity for violence, there was a long moment of silence. Then they untied Joshua, and his body collapsed to the ground. He lay there in the dirt, barely breathing, and everyone thought he would either die there or be broken forever, reduced to a shell of who he had been. But then, slowly, impossibly, Joshua lifted his head. His eyes, though clouded with pain, were clear. He looked at Boone, then at Jameson, then at the assembled crowd of enslaved people. And in a voice that was weak but unmistakable, he said, "I am still here. You have not broken me. You will never break me." The impact of those words was electric. The enslaved people watching felt something shift inside them, a recognition that resistance was not futile, that spirit could survive even the worst physical brutality, that Joshua had just demonstrated something profound about the indestructibility of human dignity. Even some of the overseers were unsettled because they had just witnessed something that contradicted everything the system of slavery was built on. The idea that sufficient violence could reduce a person to nothing, could strip away all sense of self, could create total submission. Joshua, bleeding and broken in body, had just proven that idea false. Over the next weeks, Joshua's physical recovery was slow and excruciating. Naomi and other women in the community cared for him, cleaning his wounds with herbs and remedies passed down through generations, sitting with him through fevered nights, feeding him when he was too weak to feed himself. The wounds on his back would scar, permanent marks that he would carry for the rest of his life, a physical record of that day. But the psychological impact of what he had done, of how he had faced that punishment, rippled outward far beyond his own recovery. People started calling him Unbreakable Joshua, and his story spread from plantation to plantation, carried by people who were sold or traded, by free black people who had contact with enslaved communities, by the secret networks of communication that existed despite all attempts to prevent them. The story that spread was not about the violence itself, but about Joshua's response to it, about the fact that he had maintained his dignity and his sense of self through an ordeal designed to strip both away. Parents told their children about Unbreakable Joshua when they needed examples of strength. Preachers referenced him in secret services held in the woods at night when they talked about enduring faith. Organizers of escape attempts and small rebellions invoked his name as a symbol of what was possible, of the fact that the spirit could not be chained even when the body was. Joshua became more than just a man. He became a symbol, a living proof that the system of slavery could not achieve its ultimate goal of total dehumanization. But what was the actual effect on Joshua himself? The experience changed him in ways both visible and invisible. He became quieter, more internal, less likely to engage in casual conversation. The physical pain of his scarred back was constant, a reminder every moment of every day of what had happened. He suffered from nightmares, from moments when the memory of that pain would overwhelm him, from a deeper weariness that came from understanding just how brutal the world could be. But he also experienced something unexpected, a kind of freedom within bondage. Having survived the worst that the system could do to him without being broken, he found that he feared it less. "They already did the worst thing they could do," he told Naomi one night. "They tried to destroy me and they failed. What else can they do to me that would be worse? I have already walked through that fire and come out the other side. They cannot threaten me with it anymore." This psychological shift made Joshua dangerous in a way that concerned the overseers. A man who does not fear the worst punishment is a man who cannot be fully controlled. Jameson considered selling Joshua, getting rid of this troublesome presence, but he also recognized that doing so would be seen as an admission that he could not control his own enslaved population, which would damage his reputation. So Joshua stayed, but he was watched carefully, given tasks that kept him somewhat isolated, treated with a mixture of resentment and wary respect, even by men who would never admit that an enslaved person could command respect. Joshua used his newfound psychological freedom strategically. He became more active in helping others, counseling people who were struggling, teaching them the lessons his grandmother had taught him about maintaining inner dignity, helping to organize small acts of resistance that slowly undermined the efficiency and profitability of the plantation. He and Naomi, whose relationship had only deepened through the ordeal, began teaching other couples how to maintain their connections despite the system's attempts to break all bonds, how to love and support each other as an act of resistance, as a way of asserting their humanity. One of the most important things Joshua did in the years after his beating was to become a teacher of psychological resilience. He would gather small groups in the cabin at night or in the fields when overseers were not watching, and he would talk about how to survive slavery without being destroyed by it. The body can be enslaved, but the mind does not have to be, he would say. Every day, you have to do something, even something small, that reminds you that you are human, that you have agency, that you exist beyond what they try to make you. Sing a song that you choose. Think a thought that is yours alone. Remember a moment of joy. Plan for a future they say you cannot have. These are acts of freedom, even in bondage. These are ways we keep ourselves whole. These teachings resonated deeply because they were practical and achievable. People could not escape. Most could not fight back openly without being killed. But everyone could engage in this internal resistance, this refusal to internalize the dehumanization. Joshua's philosophy spread and became part of the survival toolkit of enslaved communities, another strategy alongside more visible forms of resistance. It was not a substitute for fighting for actual freedom, but it was a way to maintain the psychological and spiritual strength necessary to continue that fight, to survive long enough to see freedom and to emerge from bondage still whole. In 1847, 5 years after his beating, Joshua was working in the field when he saw a young man, perhaps 19 years old, being beaten by an overseer for a minor infraction. The young man was crying, pleading for mercy, visibly breaking under the assault. Joshua finished his row of cotton, walked over to where the young man was being beaten, and placed himself between the whip and the victim, exactly as he had done with Naomi 5 years earlier. The overseer, not Boone but a different man, stopped, stunned. "Are you insane? Do you not remember what happened last time?" Joshua looked at him calmly and said, "I remember perfectly. Do what you need to do, but you will not break this young man today. If you need to beat someone, beat me. I have already survived it once. I will survive it again." The overseer was in an impossible position. If he backed down, he would appear weak. If he beat Joshua again, he would risk creating another legend, another story of Joshua surviving brutality without breaking. He chose to walk away, muttering threats, but not following through. The young man Joshua had protected looked at him with wonder and gratitude. "Why would you risk that for me? You do not even know me." Joshua smiled, the first real smile anyone had seen from him in years. "I do know you. You are human. You are worthy of protection, and you deserve to be treated with dignity. That is enough. And you need to know something. You are not alone. None of us are alone. We protect each other. That is how we survive. That is how we resist." That incident, and others like it, cemented Joshua's status not just as a symbol, but as an active leader in the enslaved community. He became someone people came to for advice, for comfort, for strength. He became someone who embodied the philosophy he taught, living it every day, demonstrating that it was possible to maintain dignity and humanity even in the worst circumstances. He also became more strategic in his resistance, working with others to organize work slowdowns, to damage equipment in ways that looked like accidents, to pass information about routes north to people who were planning to escape, to create a culture of mutual aid and solidarity that made the community stronger and more resilient. In 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, making it even more dangerous for enslaved people to escape to northern states because they could be captured and returned even there. This created a sense of despair in many enslaved communities, a feeling that freedom was now even more impossible than before. But Joshua used this moment to teach a different lesson. legal freedom, the kind recognized by white society that has always been denied to us. But there is another kind of freedom, the freedom of the spirit, the freedom of knowing who you are regardless of what the law says. That freedom, nobody can take from us unless we give it away. So yes, the laws are worse now. Yes, escape is harder. But we are not less free in our spirits than we were before, because that freedom never depended on their laws, it only ever depended on us. This was not a call to accept enslavement, but a call to recognize that psychological liberation could coexist with physical bondage, and that the former was necessary to achieve the latter. People who maintained their sense of self, their sense of worth, their sense of possibility. Those people were much more likely to survive, to seek freedom when opportunities arose, and to build communities that could sustain resistance. Joshua understood that the fight for freedom was not just external but internal, and that winning the internal battle was essential to having any chance at the external one. In 1855, 13 years after his beating, Joshua was 45 years old and still working on the Jameson plantation. His back bore the permanent scars of those 50 lashes. His body was aging under the strain of a lifetime of hard labor, but his spirit remained unbroken. Naomi, who had remained by his side through everything, gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Esther after Joshua's grandmother. The birth was dangerous. Naomi nearly died, but she survived. And when Joshua held his daughter for the first time, he wept for the first time since his beating. "You are born into bondage," he whispered to baby Esther, "but you are not born broken. You are whole and perfect and free in your spirit. I will make sure you know that every day of your life." Raising a child in slavery was the hardest thing Joshua had ever done. Harder even than surviving 50 lashes, because now he had to watch someone he loved grow up in a system designed to crush her, and he had to find ways to protect her spirit while knowing he could not protect her body. He and Naomi taught Esther everything they could, practical skills for survival, but also songs and stories that connected her to a heritage beyond slavery, that taught her she came from people who were kings and queens, warriors and healers, builders and artists, people who were fully human and dignified long before slavery existed, and would be fully human and dignified long after it ended. The story of unbreakable Joshua continued to spread throughout the 1850s, even reaching the ears of abolitionists in the North, who recorded it in narratives and used it as evidence of the indomitable human spirit that slavery could not extinguish. Frederick Douglass mentioned Joshua in one of his speeches, though he had never met him, as an example of the fact that enslaved people were not passive victims, but active resistors who maintained their humanity against impossible odds. Harriet Tubman, when she made her dangerous trip south to guide people to freedom, would sometimes tell stories of Joshua to encourage people who were terrified and doubting, saying, "If that man could survive 50 lashes without breaking, you can survive this journey. We all have that strength inside us when we need it." But what happened to Joshua himself in the end? He never achieved legal freedom during his lifetime. He was never able to escape north, never able to purchase his freedom, never lived to see the Emancipation Proclamation. He died in 1860 at the age of 50, his body finally giving out after a lifetime of exploitation and the lingering effects of the beating he had suffered 18 years earlier. He died in the cabin he shared with Naomi and their daughter, surrounded by people who loved him. And his last words were to Esther, who was 5 years old. "Remember, baby girl, you are free inside, always free inside, and someday that inside freedom will match the outside freedom. And when it does, you fly. You fly as high and as far as you can." Joshua was buried in the enslaved people's cemetery at the edge of the Jameson plantation, in an unmarked grave, because enslaved people were not considered worthy of marked graves. But the community marked it in their own way, with a ring of stones that they would maintain and pass down knowledge of for generations. Even after emancipation, even after the cemetery was abandoned and overgrown. Descendants of the enslaved community at Jameson Plantation would come back to that spot, clear the weeds, replace the stones, tell the story of unbreakable Joshua to their children and grandchildren, making sure his name and his example were never forgotten. Naomi lived until 1897, long enough to see emancipation, long enough to see her daughter Esther grow up free, marry, have children of her own. Naomi spent her final decades telling Joshua's story to anyone who would listen, writing it down with the help of her granddaughter, who had learned to read and write, making sure it was preserved for history. In her account, she wrote, "People remember Joshua for surviving 50 lashes without breaking, and that is important. But what I want people to understand is that he survived not through physical toughness alone, but through spiritual strength, through the teachings his grandmother gave him, through love and community and faith in his own worth. He survived because he refused to believe what they told him about himself. He survived because he knew deep in his soul that he was human, complete, worthy of dignity. That knowledge sustained him through the beating, through 13 more years of bondage, through everything. And that knowledge is his true legacy, the thing he passed down to me, to our daughter, to everyone whose life he touched. The truth about Joshua's survival of 50 lashes is not a story about superhuman endurance or pain tolerance. It is a story about the power of internal freedom, about maintaining one's sense of self and worth in circumstances designed to strip both away. It is a story about resistance that happens in the mind and spirit before it happens in the body, about the fact that being enslaved and being broken are not the same thing, that one can be subjected to terrible things and still maintain dignity and humanity. It is a story about how identity and self-knowledge are forms of resistance, how refusing to internalize oppression is itself an act of rebellion, how teaching others to do the same creates communities capable of sustaining resistance over generations. What Joshua understood, what his grandmother Esther taught him, and what he passed forward, is that the battle for freedom happens on multiple levels simultaneously: the legal and political level of changing laws and systems, the physical level of escape and rebellion, and the psychological and spiritual level of refusing to accept dehumanization. All three levels are essential. You cannot win the external battles if you have already surrendered internally. But if you maintain your internal freedom, your sense of self and worth, then you have a foundation from which to fight all the other battles. You have something that cannot be taken from you, a core of identity that survives even when everything else is stripped away. This is why Joshua's story resonated so powerfully and why it continues to matter generations later. It speaks to a universal human experience, the need to maintain dignity in degrading circumstances, to preserve identity in contexts that try to erase it, to find sources of strength when external sources have been cut off. Joshua's specific circumstances were slavery in the American South in the 19th century, but the psychological and spiritual lessons are applicable to anyone facing dehumanization, oppression, or systematic attempts to break their spirit. The specifics matter enormously for historical understanding, but the principles transcend those specifics and speak to fundamental aspects of what it means to be human and how humans resist threats to their humanity. As we close this story, think about Joshua tied to that whipping post, pain radiating through every nerve in his body, consciousness fragmenting, but somewhere deep inside, holding on to the knowledge that he was more than what was being done to him, that his worth was inherent and not dependent on how others treated him. Think about him lifting his head after the 50th lash and declaring that he was still there, still unbroken. Think about what that moment meant to everyone who witnessed it, how it changed their understanding of what was possible, how it gave them permission to believe in their own unbreakability. Think about him years later, stepping between a whip and a young man he did not even know, willing to risk it all again because protecting human dignity had become more important than protecting himself. Think about Naomi, loving him through everything, caring for his broken body, carrying his child, and then carrying his story forward after he was gone. Think about Esther, his grandmother, who planted seeds of resistance in a young boy that would grow into something that sustained not just him, but an entire community. Think about little Esther, his daughter, born into bondage but taught every day that she was whole and free in spirit, carrying that teaching into actual legal freedom and passing it to her own children. Think about all the unnamed people who heard Joshua's story and found strength in it, who used his example to sustain themselves, who survived because they learned that survival was possible. If this story moved you, if it changed how you think about resilience, about dignity, about resistance, about what it means to maintain your humanity when systems try to strip it away, then subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you can experience more stories that honor the depth and complexity of human endurance and courage. Share this story with someone who needs to understand that they are more than what happens to them, that their worth is inherent and unchangeable, that the spirit can remain free even when the body is chained. Leave a comment telling me what aspect of Joshua's journey spoke most powerfully to you. These stories are not just historical records, they are lessons in how to be human, how to resist, how to survive, and how to maintain dignity no matter what circumstances we face. Remember Joshua, remember Esther, remember Naomi, remember all the people who refused to be broken, who maintained their humanity against impossible odds, who proved that some things cannot be destroyed no matter how much violence is inflicted upon them. Until next time, remember, you are whole, you are complete, you are worthy, and no one can take that from you unless you let them. Thank you for listening, and never forget their names.